All right, are we ready to start? Everything's all set? Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Adam White, and I'm wait for my walk-up music to end. Thanks. Well, once again, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Adam White. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI in the Department on Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all together today with our two guest speakers to talk about an interesting and important new book. Most of the time when we're talking about the Constitution here at AEI, we're thinking a lot about checks and balances. But of course, some parts of the Constitution are more checked and balanced than others. And one of the most interesting and in many ways unilateral powers within the Constitution is the president's pardon power. I'll read it here from Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The president, quote, shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And with those few words, there's a very interesting constitutional history and, of course, a very interesting constitutional present. And on both the history and the present-day debates, you all should read this wonderful new book. We have copies freely available, titled The Presidential Pardon, The Short Clause with a Long Troubled History. And we're very lucky to be joined by the author, Professor Prakash of the University of Virginia. Sai is the University of Virginia's James Monroe Distinguished Professor of Law. His previous books include 2020's The Living Presidency, an Originalist Argument Against Its Ever-Expanding Powers, and 2015's Imperial from the Beginning, The Constitution of the Original Executive. He clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas, and also, I'm very glad to say, he clerked for Judge Lawrence Silberman. And he's joined by my colleague, Gary Schmitt. Gary is a senior fellow here at AEI, where his work focuses on the presidency, national security, and the Constitution. For years, he led AEI's program on American citizenship, our civics program. He still oversees and edits our annual Walter Burns Constitution Day lecture. He's edited several of AEI's other volumes on the presidency and the Supreme Court, and he's currently co-writing a 2-volume history of the early presidency. Before joining AEI, Gary was executive director of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and minority staff director for the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. We applaud first because it's all downhill from here. Let's start with a very, very broad big picture question, a couple of big picture questions. Sai, you end your book with a reflection on what you describe as the pardon dystopia, our modern pardon dystopia. Could you maybe describe that, maybe to set the scene for the current state of the debates around the issue we're going to discuss today? What is the pardon dystopia?
Well, it's a advertising labeling exercise, but in reality, I think we have sort of 4 strands coming together all at once that don't portend for a good future. One is, I think, presidents making promises to pardon various crimes, and they're doing that obviously to get votes. And unlike most promises presidents make, this is a promise they can absolutely keep because they can do it unilaterally. Joe Biden did this with marijuana. He promised to pardon all the marijuana offenses. And of course, many of us may think it's fine to pardon those offenses because we don't think marijuana ought to be criminalized in the first instance. But one can see how this would be an attractive political issue for Biden. He wanted to get the youth vote. He made that promise. He then issues the pardon 2 years into his term, right before the midterms, on the same day he issues student debt relief. It's clearly both political in the sense of when he made the promise, but also when he fulfills the promise right before the midterm elections. Donald Trump has his own, promised pardon, and that has to do with January 6th. So there's this, I think, this issue of promising pardons in order to secure office as president. There's the phenomenon of policy pardons, where you don't necessarily make a promise, but you think that some statute enacts too high a penalty for the underlying offense. Perhaps you think tax evasion should be subject to a maximum of 5 years in prison. The statutes have a 20-year term. Well, you can effectively, modify the statute for your term and all those people who've committed the offense beforehand by just saying everybody who committed this offense will get a 5-year term rather than a 20-year term, which means that there are no mandatory minimums under the Constitution. So that would be like a policy pardon. I think pardoning allies of various sorts has got to be an issue, particularly administration allies. One can imagine the president, a bad president, bad man president of a Holmesian president saying, look, you do what I tell you to do. Before I leave office, I will pardon you, and you don't have to worry about being prosecuted by the next administration. Whatever you do, you're immunized. You could immunize ICE agents or IRS agents or other people that are doing your bidding, and thereby get a lot of sort of eager foot soldiers for whatever you're trying to accomplish, whether legal or illegal. That has to be on the table after Joe Biden's pardons on January 6th. Joe Biden's pardons of people that were perceived as oppositional figures to Trump. From Trump's perspective, those people were out to get him, and Biden has shown, I think, that you can immunize people that you think might be subject to being prosecuted later on. And then finally, pardoning contributors and business associates. There was a taboo after President Clinton's pardon of Mark Rich and his pardon of FALN terrorists and Hasidic Jews in New York. All those pardons were about politics, I think. Mark Rich's wife contributed to his library. The other two pardons were thought to be useful to Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign. President Trump has pardoned contributors and also pardoned, apparently, a business associate. And we can expect, it's certainly possible that presidents going forward will have no compunctions about pardoning contributors, because of course, why should contributors be the only set of people in the country who can't get pardons, right? They can secure meetings, they can secure legislative support. Why can't they secure pardons? And so I think there's a taboo that's been broken, and I'm not sure that it can, the bell can be unrung.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to at least start at the end of the book and put all of that on the table. Now let's go back to the beginning and work our way back to the present day. And so one more big picture question to start with before I bring Gary in. What does the Constitution's pardon power tell us about the constitutional presidency? You've written all these books and articles over the years about the presidency and so many of its facets. What does the pardon power in the Constitution tell us about the founders' sense of the constitutional presidency?
It's a really interesting question, Adam. I don't know if I would think of it that way. I think they believe there has to be a pardon power. Every government to that point had a pardon power. At the state level, it's fragmented in various ways, given to a plural executive, sometimes checked by the legislature. Certain crimes are exempted from the pardon power, like treason or murder. But there's always some authority to mitigate sanctions, in part because criminal sanctions back then are so harsh that they think there's a need on the back end to have some way of mitigating them. They also believe that society is racked by civil wars from time to time, and that a well-timed pardon will possibly nip the Civil War in the bud. This is a lesson from English and British history. And of course, there are early rebellions of various sorts: the Whiskey Rebellion, the Freeze Rebellion. Shays Rebellion precedes the Constitution. Of course, we had a civil war, right, where the pardon was used. So they think that the president's better able to wield that than a legislative body. The president can credibly make promises to pardon. So it's inevitable that there's going to be a pardon, and they think it's best vested in a single person rather than in many. Are they thinking about what it says about the presidency writ large? It's an interesting question. I mean, it's like any other group. They're meeting in a building and they're making decisions. I don't know if they're sitting back and thinking about, well, what does this say about our vision of the presidency, as opposed to this is perhaps the most useful way to vest the power given our current circumstances.
Gary, what do you think? As somebody who spends so much time studying the presidency.
Well, I think one of the things I was going to ask you about is one reason why I think the presidency was given that power in a unique way, as you say, in the States. While they gave the pardon power to the governor, it was always circumscribed by the legislature and/or Privy Council and the like, or a limit on what they could pardon. How much of this decision to make it a really quite unilateral power with the president is driven by Shays Rebellion? I mean, there's this moment, there's a kind of a crisis, and circumscribing the power at the time probably would be seen as really quite problematic. So I wonder whether the immediate events before the convention actually have a much more important role in how this came out in the Constitution.
Well, Gary, I mean, I think what you're saying is certainly true. Shays' Rebellion is in 1787, and they're meeting in 1787, so they're definitely thinking about it, and people have written about Shays' Rebellion's influence on the Constitution's various parts. So I think that's got to be playing a role. I think another role that's underappreciated is they look at Washington as the presumptive first president. They have utter confidence in his judgment, and so they're more willing to vest unilateral authority with the president, thinking, well, Washington's going to be the first president, so why can't we repose more powers in this person whom we, have such great regard for? I always tell my students, if the Constitution's, amended or created in 1975, it looks rather different, right? Because people think of Richard Nixon, they're no longer thinking of George Washington.
Yeah, I sort of think that's a half-truth. Because if you go, I mean, you've done this as well, when you go through the deliberations at the convention, and there's George Washington presiding as the president of the convention, it is kind of remarkable how the willingness of them to talk about characters holding the highest office that aren't George Washington. So I wonder whether there was, a much more deep structural reason for the reasons for creating the office that they did. I want to give one of the questions I had when I read the book, which, by the way, is a really fine book, and I really highly recommend it. It's a great read. I mean, during this founding period, of course, there was really two reasons for the pardon power. One was generally mercy, the laws, being too strict for a just result. And the second one were national security reasons. In a time of crisis, as Hamilton says in Federalist 74, this apt use of a pardon power might have a real impact on putting down a rebellion or some other crisis. Today, the number of federal statutes is humongous, and we've created, the pardon power now fits within a system that the founders never could have imagined. And so the question I have is, and this is, I know where the court would be today, but the question I have is, could one make an argument that the kinds of pardons we're seeing, that they're layouts that are outside the bounds of mercy or constitutional or national security crisis, those kinds of pardons are actually unconstitutional? Could you imagine a court, not this court, but could you imagine an argument?
Yeah, well, I think you'd be lacking imagination if you couldn't imagine such a court. I think the pardon power has always been exercised in ways that some people found to be problematic, right? People getting pardons because they knew people at the king's court, right? There are discussions of lobbyists in Britain lobbying for pardons, right? And there are discussions in the Lincoln administration about people lobbying for pardons. And why do lobbyists matter? Because there's obviously a sense that sometimes the lobbyists are lobbying for people that are unworthy of a pardon, right? If they were only helping people that were worthy, it would be a civic, it would be like a public service they were performing rather than something else. So I completely agree with you that there are lots of pardons that are problematic. I think that's just an inevitable feature of discretion. The book is trying to highlight the recent upswing, I think, in improper pardons that are related to politics in a way that perhaps wasn't true before. I think we are in a sort of crisis right now with respect to pardons. I also agree with your earlier part, Gary, that of course there are structural reasons for creating a strong executive. I don't want to suggest otherwise.
Well, Sai, since you've alluded to the history a few times and to the other possible ways in which the Constitution might have structured the pardon power, could you maybe delve into that a little bit? What were some of the precedents for this kind of power, either in the states and colonies or in British government?
Well, I think that the British example is the most obvious example because it's unconstrained, right? Yeah. There are some statutory constraints that Parliament enacts from time to time, But the U.S. Constitution only has that one constraint related to impeachment, and it has another implicit constraint that it's got to be an offense against the United States. Presumably, it's collective capacity, so the president can't pardon state offenses. Those are the two restrictions. There are other implicit restrictions, right? The president can't pardon an ongoing offense. If you're polluting from your factory, the president can't absolve you of the responsibility to comply with the law. The president can't dispense with the law by giving you a right to violate the law. It has to be after you violate the law, not before. Those are all implicit restrictions, but the president is the one who can forgive the violation in a way that's extraordinary given what's going on in the states. And this is a highly criticized feature of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton himself at the convention says the president shouldn't be able to pardon for treason. But when it gets sent to the states, as you know, it's an up or down vote on the entire thing, and states aren't able to say, we will only ratify if you agree to these changes. And so there are suggestions to amend the Constitution, but none of them go anywhere. And the way to think about it is they think the Constitution as a whole is worthy of ratification, even if it has some blemishes, and perhaps in the future those blemishes will be fixed. But there are a lot of criticisms from anti-federalists in particular. And Hamilton in the Federalist Papers doesn't deny that there are these issues. He just thinks it's better, all things considered, to leave it as is.
What about in the states, or even within the colonies? What sort of structure do they have around the pardon power?
So some states vest the pardon power in a plural executive, which immediately introduces an internal check because you might have disagreement within the internal executive. So Virginia and Pennsylvania essentially have plural executives. They have a council. They may have someone called the governor, but they only have one vote on the council, and they might be outvoted by the council on various issues. And so, imagine if we had a plural presidency, right? Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and whoever. They might disagree with each other from time to time, and there might not be something might not be done that would have otherwise been done if Donald Trump is the sole president, as he is in the real world. So an executive council introduces some deliberation and some internal checks. Additionally, they sometimes gave the president the power to issue a reprieve, which would be a temporary suspension of a sentence, with the legislature the one who actually issued the pardon. So someone's about to be executed, the governor thinks maybe they shouldn't be, they would issue a reprieve, and then it would expire after a certain time unless the legislature issued a pardon. Well, that's a very different power, right? Because it's ultimately just saying we're going to put things on hold for a spell and then let the pardoner, the legislature, decide. And then other times they say you can't pardon treason, presumably because we're afraid that you might be involved in the treason. That's got to be done by the legislature. Those are some examples, and but I mean, those are real-world examples. We can think of other checks, right? Imagine that the president could pardon only with the advice and consent of the Senate. That's not entirely unusual, given that we see two advice and consent clauses in the Constitution.
So when we talk about advice and consent, I mean, not advice and consent, but checks and balances, it's always struck me when the discussion about the pardon power and how it's been abused and used in the last several decades. And there's a tendency to talk about the pardon power as a kind of plenary thing. I'm always struck by the degree to which the absence of a discussion of what's happened to the impeachment power. Because I would imagine, and I think this is true, that the founders would have thought, okay, you've given this really quite awesome power to the president, but still, if he abuses it, even though it's a legitimate power, but he uses it for illicit purposes, you can be impeached and convicted. But with the impeachment power becoming, the constitutional version of a dodo bird, is that the, I mean, that's, I would argue, is the principal reason why presidents feel free to do what they've done in the last several decades.
I think you're absolutely right, Gary. I mean, early on, Jefferson says impeachment's a scarecrow. No executive official has ever been impeached and removed. It's only been judges. Of course, sometimes that means they're just resigning because they know they're going to be convicted in the Senate. So I think impeachment hasn't proven as much of a check on the presidency as they would have supposed, in part because of the rise of political parties where a good portion of the House or the Senate views the president as a party leader and someone that can't be criticized, at least not criticized freely, or because they're afraid of their own standing within the party and perhaps being primaried or, having a party divided at the general election. I think also the fact that presidents can't run for more than 2 terms means that in the second term, they know that they can do things that, where they can't be held responsible for it electorally because they can't run again. And I think that does make them a little more bold in their second term. And of course, we do see a lot of pardons that are controversial at the end of a president's tenure in office. Either if they lose after the end of the first term, they might be more willing to do certain things. And certainly at the end of the second term, they are more free because they don't suffer electoral consequences. They do suffer reputational consequences, but they perhaps suppose that time will heal those wounds.
So how did that actually arise? And we're so accustomed now to presidents signing a wave of pardons on literally the 11th hour of the last day in office. Was, to the extent that the pardon power was used early in the Republic, was that a feature then for presidents who had not stood for re-election, or is that really a modern development?
I think you'll always find lots of pardons at the end of a term, in part because presidents receive petitions and don't act upon them, and then they feel a need to kind of finish unfinished business. So at Washington, I think, issued pardons at the end of his term. I think what's going on now, to go back to Gary's interesting point, is that there's far more criminal laws. There are far more accused and far more criminals. There's still only one president, and so there's a backlog of petitions that come from the Justice Department through the vetting process there that sit at the White House, and it's obviously not a high priority for the president to go through thousands of petitions. But at the end of the term, I guess they feel some need to make some headway with these petitions, and so that's a reason for going through them. But there have also been other times in our, other dates that have been kind of special. There were a lot of Christmas Day pardons. There were a lot of what you might call festive pardons, where presidents would issue pardons on certain festivals. Yeah. And this kind of goes back to Britain. There was a coronation pardon at the beginning of every monarch's reign, where they would pardon thousands of people. And it was, I'm the king, and I'm very happy, and guess what? You're all going to get a pardon. Yeah. And that's sort of why we would have pardons around Christmas time as well, or 4th of July. The same kind of reason. It's a day of celebration, and you're helping someone, presumably, hopefully someone worthy.
Yeah, we have that today in this day and age on Thanksgiving, right? With the turkeys.
With the turkey, that's right.
Yeah. Also, when we get a new president of AEI, he usually pardons the scholars, and we go on.
So how was the pardon power really used in the early presidencies, though? Gary, I'd love your thoughts on this too.
Well, this is a great part of the book. I don't want to interrupt, but your discussion of Washington's use of the pardon power is really quite striking.
So I've got a chapter on Washington, and then the subsequent chapter, the next chapter is about pardon controversies in the first, over across presidential administrations, where there's a claim of politicization. With respect to Washington, I just wanted to see what Washington was doing, how he handled pardon applications, and it's what you'd expect. He shows wisdom and judgment and circumspection. He receives a pardon petition from the prisoner. He then writes the district attorney who prosecuted. He writes to the judge who heard the case and asks for their opinion about the trial and the person. And then sometimes he asks his cabinet, and sometimes he asks Supreme Court justices what they think about the situation. And he mulls it over and he makes a decision. And in his pardon, he will tell you why he's granted the pardon. This person was actually innocent. This person didn't know about the law. This person has suffered enough. This person has led an exemplary life until this point. And he'll list 2 or 3 reasons, then he'll sometimes say, and other reasons. But he's giving you reasons because he understands that this is something for posterity. And in fact, pardons aren't written to the person who benefits from them. They're written to the world, right? They're public documents. And so he's writing to the world, and he even tells, I think he tells, maybe it was the Attorney General, keep this evidence because I want people to know why I issued the pardon. So he's the ideal president in so many ways. He's just very careful about it. I'm not saying that his successors weren't careful, but he's not accused of politicizing the pardon power. His successors are. John Adams is said to have pardoned the Freeze Rebellion, the rebels in the Freeze Rebellion in western Pennsylvania, in part to get votes in Pennsylvania. And whether that's true or not, he does get more votes in Pennsylvania, both popular votes and electoral college votes the second time around. He doesn't win the presidency the second time around, but he does get more votes, which raises the question, did he do so because he thought there were good public policy reasons for these pardons, or did he do so to get votes? Jefferson is accused by Abigail Adams of pardoning someone who had criticized her husband, John Adams. Jefferson's response is, well, I did it because the Sedition Act is unconstitutional. And Abigail Adams says, no one I know believes you. You pardon this guy because he's been consistently critical of Federalists. He's your party ally. I know you've been subsidizing him for years. You're just pardoning one of your allies in the press. This has nothing to do with the Constitution. And Jefferson's response is, well, you'll have to judge me by my lifetime of public service, right? And people will have to draw their own judgments, which is, of course, always true, right? Because no president says, I pardon for the wrong reasons, right? They're not, that's not going to be said. So there's those two interesting pardons where people are accusing them of doing so for political reasons. I flash forward to Lincoln and Johnson. And Lincoln, his pardon of Confederates is actually tied to their supporting the Emancipation Proclamation. They have to support it, which I think means they can't contest it, even if it liberates their slaves, right? And you might think, well, my initial reaction is, well, this is good. Like, everyone opposes slavery, and he's making sure that the Emancipation Proclamation works. But one can quickly see how this is problematic, right? Suppose the president says, I will pardon you only if you support my immigration policies, or only if you support my budget, or only if you support this or that. And you can see why, well, that seems like you're purchasing someone's political support or submission. And you might think, well, that sort of conditional pardon is sort of constitutionally problematic. Johnson continues that policy, but what's interesting about Johnson is he is told, if you issue an amnesty before the Democratic Convention, it will help you secure the Democratic nomination. His cabinet meets, they all decide he should issue an amnesty. He issues the amnesty on the first day of the Democratic Convention. He is told it's very helpful. He doesn't get the nomination in 1868, but it seems like it's designed to help him get the nomination. So it's another sort of politicized pardon. More modern examples would be Ford and Nixon. There's a claim, never proven, that Ford is pardoning Nixon in return for Nixon resigning. Mm-hmm. There are claims about George H.W. Bush and Iran-Contra. Of course, about Clinton and the pardon of Mark Rich and the pardons of the FALN and Hasidic Jews in New York, and how it helps Clinton's presidential library and potentially helps Senator Hillary Clinton.
Well, to go back to the beginning then again, Gary, it's very interesting then. As you know, Washington was so deliberate about setting precedents and being seen as setting precedents in every facet of his administration. And so here he's doing it too self-consciously with respect to the pardon power. But whereas future presidents really were constrained or constrained themselves to so many of Washington's precedents, were wary of being seen as going beyond Washington. It's interesting that the pardon power is a place where maybe Washington's precedents or efforts to set precedents didn't quite stick. I wonder what that says about the pardon power.
Yeah, well, I also think probably it has something to do with the fact that Washington was extremely conscious of the fact that his authorities were cabined by the various oaths and duties he had. So I'd be interested in going back and looking at actually the language inside some of those pardon powers about how he tied the pardons themselves to his constitutional responsibilities, either specifically or broadly. I think that element of understanding of the president's power-duty nexus disappeared very quickly in presidential life. So I think that's one of the reasons why the precedents that Washington sort of tried to set disappeared so quickly.
Yes.
So
you want to speculate on that at all?
Well, it's really hard trying to read the take care clause with the pardon clause, right? Because the take care clause says you have to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The pardon clause essentially says, the statute says 10 years, but you can make it 5. You can commute it. Or the statute says someone guilty of this should be, put to death, but you can commute it to a life sentence. And so there's a little bit of a tension there between this duty and this power, which in some respects, is a negation of the law. Now, you can try to solve that by saying, well, the pardon clause is itself a law, and so you can use it, but then it raises the question of, well, what's left of the take care clause if the pardon clause modifies it? And so there are certain pardons where you can say that they will conduce to overall law-abiding citizenry. So if you pardon rebels in return for them laying down their arms and being peaceable, you are increasing the amount of sort of law-abiding citizens. But most pardons don't have that feature, right? Because someone in jail presumably can't violate all sorts of laws. If you pardon them, they can go out and violate a bunch of laws. And you're also negating the statute that says they have to be there for 10 years. To my knowledge, there's no discussion of the interaction of these two clauses and whether one sort of supersedes the other or not. What I do know is that pardons regularly take a statute and don't implement it the way you might suspect that you would have to if you really took that language literally.
Well, I wonder, Sai, because you're right. On the one hand, the pardon power on its face is very broad, and like all sort of broadly worded constitutional powers, it creates its own temptations. Then when I read the faithfully execute clause, it reminds me that, I mean, the clause isn't completely execute, right? I mean, we all know you can't execute every law completely in all cases. The founding generation knew as well as anybody there's going to be some judgment calls there. And so it's that phrase faithfully that's calling something out of a president, right? I don't mean necessarily religious faith, but in the same way that they had the oath clause there for a reason. They knew that you had to have some things in the Constitution that tried to bound a president, not through checks and balances, but through honor, faith, whatever. And so I maybe see the two clauses as working hand in hand. One is a very broad, open-ended power that's going to tempt its holder into abuse. And so it's exactly for these other, you have the other things exactly for that reason. The oath, the faithful execution clause, and then in addition to that, things like the impeachment clause.
Well, I mean, this kind of, I think, dovetails well with what Gary said. Yeah, certainly it's possible if you think about the word faithfully to think that you have to honestly think this somehow conduces to either better execution or a better republic if you make the pardon as opposed to not. And and you can tell a story where you would issue certain pardons for that reason and not issue others, and that might somehow make them cohere. What's interesting is that in England and even in the United States, you have this. I mentioned this tradition of coronation pardons. I guess you could think that every so often there has to be a cleansing or some kind of forgiveness, and it's just going to be time to coincide with the coronation as opposed to some other event. Washington, as commander-in-chief, had a pardon power granted by statute under the Articles, and he issued some of these sort of what I call festival pardons as well. He issued one on the day that we made a treaty with France, a Treaty of Alliance, 1778, and he pardons basically everybody in the army who's guilty of a crime. And then he issued one, I think, later on the Declaration of Independence. So what's going on there? He's kind of like forgiving everybody without regard to what they've done. And you could tell a story, well, he's just made a judgment that we ought to basically forgive everybody, wipe the slate clean, and that is somehow faithful to the system of laws that Congress created, because these are all congressional laws that impose, this military discipline. Or perhaps there is some residual tension between that kind of exercise of the pardon power and some sense of faithfulness. So for instance, in the extreme, could the president tomorrow say, look, I think everybody ought to have a clean slate, and I'm going to give it to them in the manner of George Washington and King George III. I will accept murderers and and treasonous folks, however many there are in jail. I'll accept certain heinous crimes, but everybody else, we're giving them a clean slate. I don't know. I don't know if we would think that as being consistent with the take care clause. Maybe it's consistent with some higher notion of forgiveness, right? That's implicit in the pardon power. I guess it all depends on how you read those majestic phrases in the Constitution and in the pardon clause.
It's funny that you bring up the context of Washington's background as commander-in-chief for the Constitution, granting pardons then. So I actually wanted to raise that question. For both of you, I'm very curious. How did Washington's experience in pardoning as commander-in-chief, or even just in sort of granting or dispensing or carrying out justice in the context of the Revolutionary War, I wonder how that might have shaped his view of the pardon power in peacetime. And you could say something very similar about Lincoln. He wasn't a general, of course, but Lincoln was famous for being very careful and thoughtful in how he both carried out justice in the context of the Civil War or how he used mercy in the Civil War. I mean, the stakes of both those things were so enormous it had to have some kind of formative effect on how, say, Washington thought about the pardon power. I mean, Gary, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Saib makes this point in the book too, which is that military discipline and military laws, and like civil laws at the time, the founding, were really quite onerous, and so you actually wound up, if you applied the law constantly to the letter, you were actually creating a disrespect for the law because it obviously wasn't just given certain circumstances. So there's a way in which, kind of paradoxical way in which I think Washington's example when he's commander-in-chief is he keeps the very terror of the law viable by precisely being merciful in particular, circumstances. So it's an odd phenomenon, but in the absence of having the sort of the mercy element of it, you actually undermine the law itself.
So, any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think Washington understood that the more soldiers he executed, the fewer soldiers he had. And so I think he practiced some sort of policy of decimation where you would kill 1 out of 10 soldiers for an offense. That would then serve as an example to others. And his pardons were often issued at the last second. Like authors write about a horseman galloping to the execution site and saying, you've been pardoned, because he wanted to instill the fear in the person right up to the moment so they wouldn't desert or do whatever they had done again. So I think he's very mindful about how he needs soldiers, how people, lots of people are serving and then leaving, right? And so their enlistment's up. He wants to keep his soldiers, and you can't keep them if you're executing 10% of them a year. So that's part of the policy. What's interesting about Washington as president is there is no example of a general pardon for everybody, right? He doesn't do what he did as commander-in-chief. There is no, July 4th pardon or Christmas Day pardon or a pardon in commemoration of the Treaty of Alliance with France, which is a huge deal in 1778, right? It's the first nation to recognize America's independence because they're joining us in the war against Great Britain. So that he doesn't do anything like that, which could mean that he thinks that the take care clause somehow forbids it. Or maybe he just doesn't think that he should be issuing a sort of general amnesty, with exceptions for murder, et cetera. I don't know the answer to that. There hasn't been anything like those pardons since then. There are pardons issued on Christmas Day, but they're often just discrete pardons to a bunch of people rather than some, let's put everything behind us and pardon thousands at once. I think that would seem alien to a lot of people, even though it was once a feature of British and certainly early American practices.
Yeah, speaking of presidents, I had this question. I've always wondered about it, and I can't remember if you address it in the book or not. This idea of preemptive pardons. On its face, you would think pardons have to follow, an actual indictment, a charge or even a conviction, but tossing out pardons, about offenses that haven't occurred yet. Are there precedents for that, or where'd this come from, actually?
So just to be clear, you cannot pardon before an offense, or put more precisely, if the president issues a pardon that says, I'm pardoning you in advance for tax fraud, it's invalid. The offense has to occur first. Mm-hmm. So that kind of preemptive pardon won't work. That's just a dispensation. That's barred by the English Bill of Rights, and it's never been understood to be part of the executive power in the United States. The president can't suspend a law, nor can he issue individualized licenses to violate the law. The other kind of preemptive pardon that people talk about is you're pardoned before prosecution. Well, that's always been a feature of American law. Think about a rebel fighting the United States government. If you tell the rebel, I can't pardon you until we prosecute you, the rebel's going to say, well, then I'm not laying down my arms, because you're basically telling me I'm going to lay down my arms, we're going to undergo a trial, I then have to go through that process, I guess plead guilty. No, you can pardon me now. It's preemptive in the sense that I haven't been prosecuted, but it's not preemptive in the sense that I haven't done anything wrong yet. So that kind of preemptive pardon has always been a possibility, that you can pardon people before they're prosecuted, but you can't pardon them before they've committed the offense.
So the Biden family pardons that reached back, there's been no indictment, there's been no charge, but they're pardoned for what?
Well, I mean, those pardons are in the book.
In other words, they only become active if somebody gets, so if somebody has to actually indict, even though they know that the person's going to be pardoned.
Well, so what I would say about the Biden pardons, and it's discussed in the book. Hunter is pardoned for all offenses over a 10-year period. So whatever he's done wrong for 10 years, it doesn't matter because he can't be prosecuted for it. Which means, more precisely, if some U.S. attorney tries to prosecute Hunter Biden, the person will produce the pardon, Hunter will produce the pardon, and the court will say, well, you can't prosecute Hunter Biden. More likely, the prosecutor's not even going to bother, right? Because they know it's within the 10-year period. Interestingly enough, the other family members, the siblings and the in-laws, they didn't receive a pardon for all offenses. They received a pardon for all non-violent offenses, which then makes your head spin, because you basically are saying, I think, in effect, that you're pardoning Hunter for violent offenses, because otherwise, why is there a restriction in one that's not in the other? But the end result is, yes, they can't be pardoned for all those offenses over a 10-year period. Hunter had been prosecuted, and that prosecution has been effaced by virtue of the pardon. Any other prosecution that might have arisen is also prevented. Those siblings had not been charged yet, but they can't be charged now given the pardon. Or more specifically, if they are charged, they will produce the pardon in court and the indictment will be dismissed. Yes.
But back to that first version of preemptive pardons. You said a president can't pardon somebody before a crime was committed. But at the outset of the conversation, you pointed out presidents are uniquely well positioned to make a promise and keep the promise. So a president might not technically preemptively pardon somebody, but he can make a very credible statement that he will pardon somebody. Mm-hmm. And then after the crime is committed, he makes the pardon. Now, as you said, there's really no common law or British antecedent to that in the English Bill of Rights. And it does seem on its face an affront to the notion of a pardon in the way we understood them for a very long time. Could you go the extra step and say if a president actually promised a pardon and then delivered it, that would somehow be unconstitutional? Or that is it is what it is, and it's left to things like politics and impeachment?
I mean, I talk about that possibility specifically in light of this idea that presidents will now pardon political allies at the end of their term. Mm-hmm. In particular, they might pardon their members of their cabinet or U.S. attorneys or ICE officers or, student loan forgivers, right? Whatever. We don't need to be political here in the sense of saying one party will do it and one party won't. But imagine you're a president and you want your administration to take some aggressive legal stance. Imagine that people within the administration are fearful that they might be prosecuted. Well, a pardon would prevent that, right? And you can imagine good and bad reasons for issuing that pardon. So would the pardon be unconstitutional? The book talks about this. I think it would certainly be constitutionally problematic to promise a pardon in return for the officers pursuing some aggressive attack, while they're in office. But there's a question of what it means to say it's unconstitutional. Let's all agree let's just imagine that we all agree it's unconstitutional. Two things might follow. One, the pardon's invalid, or two, the president acted unconstitutionally, but the pardon is still valid. And the pardon clause doesn't tell us which of those two things is right, because it doesn't even tell us which pardons would be unconstitutional if issued, in the sense that they were issued for the wrong reasons. Right? The pardon doesn't say you can't pardon for these 5 reasons, and it further doesn't say if you pardon for these 5 reasons, the pardon is valid, but you did something wrong, naughty, or that it's invalid, right? But I think that's, either thing is possible, right? That you might say that the Constitution, the pardon was improperly or unconstitutionally issued, and then you might say one of two things: therefore, it's invalid, or it was issued for the wrong reasons. The person acted unconstitutionally, but it's still valid as to the person because we can't take away the pardon. The pardon's still vested. So imagine, I think I talked about this in the book. Imagine a president says, "I'm only going to pardon white people," and they only pardon white people. You might think, well, that violates some equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. Is the remedy to say the pardon's not valid? That could be an answer, right? To say, well, all you guys who thought you were pardoned, you're not. But another answer would be the president acted illegally or unconstitutionally, but the pardon is still valid. Of course, a third possibility is everybody gets a pardon without regard to their race, right? That would be an interesting conclusion, right? Because the way to deal with the equal protection violation might be to extend it to everybody. The Constitution just doesn't answer those questions, it seems to me.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the modern context. A few of the things you just described a moment ago, the incentives for a president to grant broad pardons near the end of his administration. They say something about the president, but also about the president's perception of his political opponents, the opponents of the people he's pardoning. We do live in an era now where both political parties are very worried about the other party prosecuting them once that party's in office. I mean, this is the theme of the Supreme Court's recent decision in the presidential immunity case, right? One of Chief Justice Roberts' main points at the end of the opinion is we live in an era where I think he said the executive branch is at risk of cannibalizing itself with each new administration reaching back to prosecute and investigate its predecessors. So in this new era of broader pardons and precautionary pardons, politically precautionary pardons, how much of this development reflects poorly on presidents granting pardons, and how much does it reflect poorly on a new era of political prosecutions of one's political enemies?
That's a wonderful question, Adam.
Thank you very much.
I think you're saying that perhaps presidents are issuing pardons because they fear that the other side is going after them for political reasons. They fear that the other side's going to go after their allies for political reasons. And I think that's true. I do think that both parties see the other as being willing to weaponize prosecutions, and both parties have reason to think, that about the other party. I don't think it's just a feature of one party. I think, that people talk that way if they're of one party or the other, but the reality is something different altogether. But I obviously also think that it's a sad statement for the rule of law if presidents are just immunizing their allies and then claiming with some kernel of truth that they're doing so because they'll be persecuted by their enemies. So let me give you an example. Joe Biden says, I'm pardoning Hunter and family members because I'm afraid the next administration will prosecute them or persecute them, both. But of course, it's his administration's lawyers that have prosecuted Hunter Biden, and it's his administration's lawyers that are investigating his brother. I don't remember the brother's name, but it's James Biden, I believe.
Yep.
And so he's basically criticizing members of his own administration. I guess you can have the view that they're persecuting the president's family, but it seems unlikely. And it's important that people not be prosecuted for the wrong reasons, but it's also, I think, important that people not be pardoned merely because some people believe that there will be political persecution. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I do feel like we're in an age of weaponized prosecutions, but I also don't want to be in an era where presidents are regularly immunizing all their allies within the government, because that will incentivize them to do the president's bidding without fear of any sort of legal consequences as a result. I mean, imagine if Nixon told the Watergate burglars, I got your back, go ahead and burgle the Watergate, and I'll pardon you before I leave. I don't think he pardoned them. I don't know.
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
Gary, were you about to say something?
No, this conversation just reminds me that one of the anticipated elements of the constitutional system was that you would have presidents that would get reelected and reelected, and so the incentive structure for behaving yourself was just presumed much greater than if you have 2 terms or lame ducks, you know.
By the way, one of the reasons why I brought up the prosecution side of this is it seems to me that both on pardons and on prosecution around the presidency, we're seeing a really interesting reversal of the original purposes of these things. And here's what I mean. On the prosecution side, we've had now for decades different kinds of independent prosecutors. It was under a statute, the independent counsel statute, that went away. Now we have sort of a special counsel provision under regulations to give prosecutors a certain kind of independence. And why do we do that? Well, in the first instance, it was because we wanted presidents, ostensibly, this was the argument for it, we wanted a president in a case where it looked like his own administration had done wrong to not distort the prosecutorial or investigational process within that administration. We wanted to create space so that presidents wouldn't protect their own people from prosecution. There's enormous constitutional problems with that. It gives rise to the Morrison v. Olson decision. I'm very sympathetic to the Scalia side of that debate, the Silberman-Scalia side of that debate. But the point is now today, when you hear people talk about special counsel, it's usually fans of the administration that want a president to appoint a special counsel so that he can't be reined in by future administrations. We've taken special counsels as a protection against the president abusing powers, and we've used it to sort of turbocharge a president's powers. Meanwhile, with pardons, we thought of it in theory, it's supposed to be a tool of presidential mercy, of executive branch self-restraint, but it's now becoming a power that can be used and leveraged. I just think it's very interesting that maybe I'm overstating it, but the symmetry between these two things, the ways in which we've thought about presidential power and constraint on the pardon side and on the special prosecutor side. And I don't think it's a coincidence that now we're seeing these things collide, right? The prosecutions around the presidency and the use of the pardon power within the presidency. I don't know if that's really a question. It was a very long filibuster, but it's just something that occurred to me as we're thinking through a few of these different trends. Can I ask an actual question?
Yeah.
How could we reform the pardon? As we said earlier, there's any number of ways that they could have structured the pardon power. I mean, the presidency has limits with advice and consent on the appointment side of things, precisely so that presidents would be prohibited from, or at least embarrassed to, use the appointment power for the basest motives. I mean, Hamilton writes that in Federal 76. Presidents are limited on treaties and so on. We didn't limit them on the pardon power, but could we now? I mean, would it be worth considering a constitutional amendment to put some kind of Senate confirmation power on the veto? I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Well, that's a great question. The book has a chapter on reforms, and obviously one thing you could do is require the Senate's advice and consent before a pardon vests, before it takes effect. And that would mean that the president could only, pardon would only be effective if the Senate agreed. An alternative reform would be, well, the president's pardon is provisional. If the Senate or the House says no within 60 days, if the Senate or House does not say no within 60 days, then it takes effect. And that changes the dynamics. Mm-hmm. The Senate advice and consent function makes, if you put it that way, the pardon only takes effect if they affirmatively act. But you might favor what people call a legislative veto, where the president puts something before Congress, and if they don't say no, either chamber, it then takes effect. And that might sort of be a better system, I think, than advice and consent. I kind of wonder whether, advice and consent sort of overburdens a Senate that's already burdened, right? They take forever to consent to nominations, and they don't consent to treaties at all anymore. I don't know if you want to burden them this way, but it's kind of like
because the Senate is so burdened by its workload. Yeah.
Well, I'll defer to you on how burdened it is. But there's the question of actually being burdened and being having the perception that you are burdened.
Yeah.
They evidently feel burdened, right? That they're not doing more. So I think a better reform would be some kind of legislative veto where the president says, I'm going to pardon someone. the Senate and the House each have a veto over it. If either one says this is a bad idea by majority vote, then the pardon doesn't take effect. But if they don't do anything, if there's inertia, then the pardon would take effect. And I think this would deal with a lot of the problems. An alternative suggestion would just be to say that the president can't pardon the last 180 days of his second term, or his first term if he loses the election or chooses not to run. And I think that deals at least with the problem of pardoning without, kind of pardoning as you're leaving the office and not paying attention to the public or legislative sentiment about those pardons. Of course, you could have something more radical, right, by saying certain offenses can't be pardoned, but it's, I think, a bit hard to figure out what those offenses would be. And there's so many offenses that allies could be charged with that I don't. Would you list 20 offenses the president couldn't pardon? It seems a little bit problematic. And then finally, there's another reform in the book that isn't really coherent with the theme of the book, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Presidents are way behind in considering the many pardon petitions before them, and so I suggest at least the possibility that maybe someone else should also have a pardon power to deal with all the applications that the president hasn't acted upon. Because if you listen to criminal justice reform advocates, the president isn't doing a very good job of thinking about whom ought to be pardoned, in part because they don't want to have a Willie Horton situation where they release someone and then that person commits a crime and then they get blamed for it. Now, obviously, I don't want more Willie Hortons who commit crimes on parole or what have you. But you might think, that too many people are in prison, that prison sentences are too high. The president isn't able to wield the pardon pen with the same, ease and dexterity as would have been the case in the past, and partly because they have many more duties, and partly because they have many more pardon petitions. Right? I think every president leaves office with thousands of pardon petitions they haven't acted upon, and that's after the Department of Justice has sifted through the many more pardon applications. Like they act as a sieve, right? They get 50,000 and then they send 4,000 to the White House, and the president might act on 500. And so maybe maybe in some weird sense there ought to be some commission. Maybe the Congress could also have a pardon pen, right, where other people could pardon as well, which means even if the president didn't want to do it, some other entity might be able to wield the pardon pen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite open to a constitutional amendment if one could be had. I mean, I don't think you can ever, no matter what the institutional arrangement would be, you're not going to escape the partisan politics, of course. But just broadly speaking, when you combine the fact that we have, we've gone down the road of a very strong unitary executive way of thinking about the presidency, and then you combine that with the fact that presidents are head of political parties, we just have a different kind of regime than what the founding generation and the drafters of the Constitution had in mind. So it makes perfect sense to make some adjustment given the just changing nature of the polity.
Why don't we open this up to audience questions? If you have a question, just raise your hand, and the microphone will find you. And while they're getting started, I noticed neither of you raised the prospect of just the need to just abolish the pardon power altogether. I mean, is that a crazy suggestion? I mean, if the presidency is too big for the pardon power, if the presidency is just so powerful that there's just too much opportunity or temptation for the abuse of the pardon power, maybe the safest constitutional reform would be to get rid of it altogether. I'm not saying I agree with that myself. I'm struck that neither of you
would
raised
you
that.
put it someplace else? Is that what
No,
you're
I'm saying get rid of it altogether.
Yeah.
That if it went all the way through, if a prosecution went all the way through a conviction and the judge oversaw it and it got appellate review and everything, maybe in this day and age that's the safest way to mix both the execution of laws with mercy. Is abolishing the pardon power ridiculous?
Yes.
It might be. Okay.
No, I do think that the issue of mercy and the law not being applicable in all circumstances in the correct way that you would think about what the purpose of the law is, does require somebody to have the ability to step in and say, this is just simply unjust, and to the degree it's unjust, you wind up creating a dynamic where people just don't value the law itself. So
I thought posing this question to a Texan, you'd say, yeah, get rid of it. Get rid of the pardon altogether. Cy, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's like the most unlikely reform, but it's clearly on the minds of some people because more people are talking about it as a possibility of getting rid of it. If what they mean by that is getting rid of it from the president, I think it's less radical. If someone else has the authority or some body or institution or multi-member panel has the power, I think it becomes more palatable to talk about getting rid of it. I think we haven't had a rebellion in a long time. It's a mistake to think we won't have them, I guess, going forward. And it might be useful to have one person have the power in that context because, again, it's more likely to be issued by one person than by Congress or by a 50-person pardon committee. But there are clearly more people, very smart people, who are talking about getting rid of it altogether. Maybe they're just staking out a position which then allows them to compromise to something less radical. But really smart people are talking about it.
All right, well, I have 2 questions left, but I'm going to save them, and I'm sure one person in this room is going to ask one of those questions. Mikey, do you want to, there was a hand up earlier right over here, wasn't there? No? Right there.
Thank you. My name is Lawrence Brigard, and I have a quick question that made me, after you mentioned that George Washington provided pardons to both military as a commander and to civilians. In today's courts, with the court martial and the military, is it common for the president to provide a pause on that? So, I mean, even though it sounds like today the president's power is generally geared towards non-military offenses, does the president ever nowadays extend that to the military convictions as well?
Great question. The president has power to pardon all offenses against the United States. The military offenses are offenses against the United States. There were some controversial pardons, I believe, during the first Trump administration of soldiers who were charged with, I think, war crimes of various sorts, and President Trump pardoned those offenses. So the power still extends to those sorts of offenses, offenses against the laws of war, offenses against the Uniform Code and military justice. I don't think it's as much in the news because the president's pardoning so many other people that are newsworthy. But Donald Trump could pardon many, any number of military figures who've been accused of a crime or been convicted of a crime by a court martial.
I mean, traditionally, presidents have stayed away from it because military discipline requires a higher standard of obedience to military codes. So presidents typically haven't weighed in, but again, there's no bar to them doing so.
Other questions? Anybody? There's a question right over here.
Hi, Ian Sheridan. I think Lieutenant Calley, the My Lai massacre with Nixon, he did something. I think he took him out of jail. I don't know if he pardoned him, but that was a pretty controversial action in 1970-ish, something. Was that an actual pardon?
I think it was commutation.
Oh,
I think so.
So that's something a little different legally, I guess.
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's under the pardon clause. It's just the
Okay.
pardon clause mentions pardons and reprieves, and it's understood that the president can shorten a sentence. So if Gary said that he commuted his sentence, and that is an aspect of the pardon power.
That's not the reprieve power, but the pardon power?
Well, the reprieve power is just like don't execute the sentence, right?
Okay.
Like don't put them in jail yet, or don't execute them. I want to possibly issue a pardon later on. So
Okay.
reprieve is just like let's halt everything, and the pardon is anywhere from a commutation all the way to a full pardon.
Other questions? I thought somebody was going to ask about self-pardons. Can a president pardon himself or herself? Again, the clause is, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. There's no except in cases of himself. Can a president constitutionally pardon himself?
So in my 2016 book, I said yes, because of what you just said, that there's no exception. And I gave this example of a territorial governor who was given statutory authority by Congress to pardon territorial offenses. He was found guilty of contempt in court, and so he issued the following pardon. I, Isaac A. Stevens, pardon Isaac A. Stevens. Signed, Isaac A. Stevens. And so I'm like, well, this is an example. There's no limitation. In this book, I'm more open to the idea that there's a spirit of the Constitution that suggests that presidents shouldn't be issuing this sort of self-interested pardon in this way. And it's the same kind of argument that people make as to why the vice president shouldn't preside over his own trial in the Senate, right? The vice president is the president of the Senate, meaning he presides over impeachment trials in the Senate. The one time he doesn't preside over a trial that's in the Constitution is when the president's being tried. It's the Chief Justice. And the idea there is we shouldn't have the person who's going to become president if the president's convicted serve as president of the Senate. But there's no exception for when the vice president's being tried for a high crime and misdemeanor in the Constitution. But many people say there's got to be this implicit exception based on the idea that it's absurd. And I can better see the wisdom of that argument now as opposed to 2016. Part of it is that I'm less sort of wedded to the text now than I am in 2016. I'm more open to spirit-based arguments, and this certainly would be a spirit argument.
Okay, so
Yeah, go
let me
ahead,
weigh
Gary.
in.
Jump in.
No, he can't self-pardon. And I've made this argument along with my scholarly colleague, Jeff Toulis. The first point would be is that the root word for pardon is from the Latin donare, which means to give. So original textualists should be open to the fact that pardon means to give something to somebody else. So modern psychology, we say forgive ourselves, but that's modern psychology. That's not any way the founders would have thought about things. So the pardon power there has to be a recipient other than you who is giving. Second thing is that when you go through the notes of the convention, at one point, Governor Randolph raises the problem of the pardon power having to, a president perhaps hiding a conspiracy, a treasonous conspiracy by pardoning the conspirators and thereby hiding his role in it. And James Wilson rebuts, and that the pardon power doesn't prevent impeachment and then also criminal conviction. Wilson would not have made that argument if he thought the president could simply self-pardon. And as best I can tell, when I've gone through all the anti-federalist writings, even though they were quite, as Sai has mentioned, they were quite aware of some of the downsides of granting the president this broad pardon power. Never once did anybody say that there was a possibility of a president exercising a self-pardon. So I think the historical evidence is pretty clear that this was not something that they thought was within the parameters of the pardon power.
You know, Gary, for your argument, it's not just sort of in the origins of the word pardon. It's not just in the origins of the word pardon, because the provision itself in the Constitution says the power to grant reprieves or pardons, right? So there too, it's the sense of somebody giving something to somebody else. On the other hand, though, we're very accustomed to thinking about the president in two senses, right? The president is executing an office separate from his own personal interests, rights, and so on. Again, the immunity case, right? They talk about what the president is doing in his presidential capacity and what a president is doing in his personal capacity. And when you start thinking about a president as having sort of these two capacities, suddenly that example of, who was it, Isaac
A. Stevens.
Isaac Stevens granting a pardon to Isaac A. Stevens. It doesn't seem that crazy, right? It's being granted by the office holder, and it's being received by the individual. I don't think presidents should pardon themselves, though. I had Mikey.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I don't know if this is on. Oh, there it is. Quick question. So if I recall correctly, Gerald Ford, when he pardoned Richard Nixon, one of the motivations or reasons he felt comfortable doing so is that he believed that accepting a pardon was an admission of guilt, or constituted an admission of guilt by the party that accepts the pardon. Was he right about that? Is the constitutional history clear one way or another that accepting a pardon constitutes an admission of guilt?
So he said that. He gave 20 reasons why he should pardon Nixon. He gave maybe 10 in the pardon, then 10 in a speech on the same day. So he was deeply interested in giving public reasons for why he did this, because he knew it was going to be controversial. And that's one of the things he said. And the Supreme Court has said that as well, but they're both wrong, because imagine that everybody in the world comes to think that this person convicted of a crime is actually innocent, right? They've got the airtight alibi comes up afterwards, right? Or they find someone, who admits that they did it and this person didn't do it. Well, does that mean the president can't pardon them because the person's actually innocent? That would be really odd. And of course, presidents have pardoned people and claimed that the person was actually innocent. And so I don't think a pardon necessarily or logically implies guilt. I don't think acceptance of the pardon logically implies guilt. Because if you think you're innocent and you've always maintained your innocence and you convince the president, I think the president can pardon you. So I think what's going on is it's a percentage game. Most people pardoned are probably guilty. So we naturally think, well, that if most people are guilty, then this person must be guilty as well. But it's a law. It's a probabilistic claim, not a claim as to any particular person. So I don't think, Biden said it doesn't mean my family's guilty. People will draw their own conclusions about whether they're guilty or not. But I don't think they could draw the necessary inference that they're guilty just because they got a pardon.
It's the way I deal with my kids.
Yeah. Sai, I'm curious, as I understand it, a president can pardon somebody over a federal crime, but only a governor, or only the state government can pardon somebody for a state crime. Is that absolutely certain? I know the language in the Constitution is to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. Is there any colorable argument that offenses against the United States includes offenses against an individual state? Is there any real argument to be had around a president pardoning somebody over a state crime? Was that ever tested?
I don't know of any president trying to pardon someone for a state offense. I think it's always been understood to be federal offenses enacted by Congress. You could make a claim that it's the United States, which includes all the subsidiary states, but it's just never been understood that way. And I think, when they want to talk about the individual states, they reference the states. And when they want to talk about the corporate entity, the larger entity, they talk about the United States. And of course, the United States is composed of the states, but I think they're conceptually distinct in the Constitution. I don't know of any other reference to the United States in the Constitution where they're referring to each of the individual states. I'd have to think about it some more. It's a very interesting question, right? Whether they somehow mean the latter, but no one's ever, I think, acted pursuant to that understanding, and it would be deeply contrary to practice. I don't think the courts would uphold it. The president could issue a pardon that says you're pardoned for this crime of Maryland. I just don't think it would be valid when tested in court.
Yeah. One last question before we go. There's a question back here. We'll take one more audience question.
Thank you, Al Milliken. What more is known about serious crimes committed by someone who was pardoned by a president?
Are there examples, I guess, of people going on to commit serious crimes after a president?
I didn't really look to see if the people that got pardons committed other crimes, but I think there's an example ripped from the headlines of the president pardoning someone in his first term, this president, and then pardoning them again in the second term because they were prosecuted by the Biden administration. And I don't remember the exact crime, but it's someone getting pardoned for two different crimes. I presume, this is a cynical part of me, that they have some in the White House, and that's why they received 2 pardons. But I don't remember what the second crime was for. I don't know if it was violent or not.
Okay, my last question, and I can't imagine ever asking this question to anybody, but you just spent a good amount of time writing an entire book about presidential pardons, so I feel totally comfortable asking you. Do you have a favorite pardon? I mean, you've studied all of this history of pardons. Is there one example of a presidential pardon, famous or not famous, that is just your favorite?
I mean, I wish you had told me this question before, and I haven't really ranked the pardons.
Yeah.
I think that Ford's pardon of Nixon was courageous because I don't believe he was doing so as part of some corrupt bargain. I think he knew he was going to face political flack, but I think he believed it would be best for the country. And that's, an act of courage if that's all true. And although Ted Kennedy criticized him at the time of the pardon, he later on saw fit to ensure that Ford got the Profiles in Courage Award. And I think, again, if you believe the story that I've just told, it was a courageous act on his part to put the country before his own, narrow political concerns. So that's an admirable thing to do. But of course, you might think anytime the president dispenses mercy for the right reasons, that's an admirable thing to do.
Yeah. Gary, I would be surprised if you had a favorite pardon, but if you have a favorite pardon you want to throw in before we go, feel free.
Well, I think some of the Lincoln pardons in particular are really quite striking, and both how prudent they were, but also how timely they were in a very Lincolnian sense.
Well, again, this is a wonderful book, and I hope you'll read it. And as it happens, we have free copies. So please come over, and I know Professor Prakash would be happy to sign them. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our guests, Gary Schmitt and our author, Saikrishna Prakash.